Welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Use Data to Create Better, More Personalized Content and Rise Above the Noise. I am very pleased to introduce Natalie Stavosky, VP at Influence & Co., and Rick Porter, Director of Solutions and Architecture at FullContact.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction. This is Natalie Stavosky, and as Kelsey mentioned, I'm a Vice President here with Influence & Co. So just to give a little bit of background on kind of who we are, it's obviously written in the slides, but just to kind of dive in a little bit deeper, we really specialize in creating engaging content and that fuels a lot of companies' content marketing efforts and really positions their key employees as influencers within their industries. So really any way that we can take the subject matter expertise of individuals within an organization and put that into a consumable piece of content, that's kind of really where we focus on. So Rick, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. So as Kelsey pointed out, I'm the Director of Solutions at FullContact, so just a little bit on that role. FullContact is a data and identity resolution company, so we really help to round out an understanding of who customers are for our partners and customers. And so in my role as the Director of Solutions, I work with those customers and partners to right fit what we offer in the way of data products and APIs so that they fit in their environment. So happy really to talk about the convergence of data, which is our specialty, with content, which is Influence & Co.'s specialty. I think that there's just so much promise in the convergence of those two areas. So just excited to be here and talk with everyone this morning.
Through the next couple of slides, we're going to kind of tee up what we're going to be in conversation about today. But I'm sure none of us are not aware of how much content is being pushed out today. So within this graphic, this shows how much content is being pushed out within 60 seconds. And so you've really got to personalize the content that you're pushing out today. You've got to leverage data and different tools to make sure that you're serving up the right type of content at the right time. So we're going to talk through a couple of those different tools as well. Influence & Co. actually, as we kind of move into the next slide, we surveyed over 140 media publication editors and over 4 million pieces of content to really get kind of a good state on how is content performing today, what are these media publications looking at. And so we'll dive into a lot of those different details within some of the findings of that survey. So if you kind of switch to the next slide there, we'll be talking about like the most successful content. We're going to be offering some original insights in terms of length of content, how we've leveraged data to inform some of that content, so that you can kind of rise above the noise and really start to be successful when you are speaking to your audience, and how data is going to play a role in that development process of the content in some type of capacity. So again, we're going to be talking through the power that data provides. We're going to be talking through data in each stage of the content creation process today. Rick's going to be diving into data in your target audience, and then we're going to be really diving into data and personalized content as well. So feel free to ask questions. These are 4 like pretty broad subject areas that we're going to be touching on, and there's a lot that goes into each of those stages. So hopefully today, between myself and Rick, we'll be able to provide you with some actionable takeaways, and obviously we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But if we need to touch base afterwards, if there's more in-depth questions that you guys have, we can definitely dive into that. So if we kind of talk through the power that data provides, and if we look at it at each piece of the content creation process. So we look at the content audience. Data is going to give you insight into who your audience is, so you can create personas for your documented strategy. You're going to be able to speak to them more effectively, and you're going to be able to send them more personalized content. If you look at how data impacts the content creation process, it can inform each step and it can provide reasons and facts to substantiate and back up any claims within your content. We look at data from a content measurement perspective. Data can be used as a benchmark to determine which content methods are working and which need to be improved on. But overall, when we're looking at data and the content development and measurement and distribution process, it's really, again, going to give you insight so you can speak to your audience at the right time. So, Rick, I think that's a really good leeway into talking about data and your target audience so we can kind of create some more of that like personalized content for them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So at the very heart of what FullContact is bringing to the mix is really this notion that in the age of the customer, the more that you actually understand those people that are your customers, you're just going to be able to engage them so much more effectively. And oftentimes what we find is companies are still kind of learning and working their way through the capabilities that are there. So one of the things that I often engage in is just trying to lay out for customers and folks that like are joining this webinar this morning to help paint a picture of the possibilities. So if you look at the slide here in front of you, we like to show this notion of connect. And connect is really taking something as simple as an email address and using that email to get an understanding of customer that pulls in social identity, that could also incorporate other elements of the physical world, so that you really have this robust or probably overused but 360-degree view of the customer. And really, FullContact has a patented identity graph that sits in the center and helps brands and partners alike pull together these views. The beauty of it is it's not just about the person in isolation, but it puts a person in context so that you can actually understand things like the job title, the company that people work for, so that you can really get a very robust view. And you can just start to imagine how all of these factors really play into creating the possibility of really getting that hyper-personalized content in front of folks. I always say, I'm a guy that works for a tech startup in the Denver area, and I happen to be a college football junkie. It's mostly torture for me because my team is never as good as I would like for them to be. But those are simple little things that if you understand about me, it's going to service marketers well, and just understanding like what type of content will resonate with me. And so if you push forward to the next slide, I'll speak a bit more about how that works mechanically. I'll cover it at a very high level, but certainly can take questions from folks if they have them at the tail end of the webinar. So you can see here in the picture view that it starts a lot of times with the data that customers already have in their data warehouse or their CRM system, whatever system of record that they have. And our identity graph is shown here in the picture, actually links these different identifiers together into this cohesive view, so that if you think about that FullContact profile that sits in the middle, it's bringing together all those data assets. And that identity is really important because it serves as a launch point for learning more about customers in a very organic way. And that's really a big part of what we're trying to do from a data products perspective, is make sure that you start with that identity and then leverage it in ways that allows you to constantly understand trends and patterns, likes, passion points for customers. So if you go to the next slide, I'll kind of dig into that a little bit more. You can kind of ignore the workflow and all of the step-by-step views here, because there's a key point that I want to leave the audience with this morning, and that is once you have that notion of identity expanded beyond just something as simple as an email, you can then start canvassing and looking out on channels like Twitter and other social networks to see what those particular people are interested in. And so that can be follows or comments, and that you can think of those as individual data points that can be attached to the very people in your CRM file so that you can just have a memory of the things that are of importance to them or the things that they engage in. So start with identity and then use identity as a springboard for understanding things that those people care about. And I think you guys can see how all of this will, start to feed into a collective view of what is important to your customers. So if you move to the next slide, I think I'd be remiss in not pointing out something that I actually see as an oversight for a lot of marketers, and I don't care if you're B2B or B2C. It's what I consider like a Chinese wall that exists where people have work personas and then they have consumer personas. And you tend to, as a consumer yourself, tend to get treated along those lines. And I think that there's an important point, and I think we'll see this more and more as time goes on, as marketers become even more sophisticated, but the convergence of those things about you as a consumer that may be impacted by things that are in your professional world. So we try and bring together the professional graph and the company graph. So if you can understand that I work for a startup and it's in the identity resolution space and it's headquartered in Denver, you're essentially daisy chaining all of these important factors together in a way that just, again, comes back to a more robust view of your consumers that can be driven, be used to drive personalization or one-to-one content, but can also be used in ways that is ultimately aggregated up into audience-level data. And so if you flip to the next slide, that's what you actually see here, because once you take all of these individuals and start thinking about, hey, I may not have 3 million distinct pieces of data to distribute content to, so I want to find the patterns in the data. I want to see if there are areas where a given audience over-indexes in an interest area. So if there are lifestyle or if there are brand interests, I want to be able to call those things out, and then I want to be able to kind of customize the content at that audience level. And so all of this entire section is simply just trying to give you guys the building blocks for how you can start with something as simple that so many customers have already living in their CRM files, like an email, and convert that into really meaningful intelligence about who those people are in the digital world, what type of content they're consuming, and have it essentially be embedded in your systems so that you're able to act on this kind of data over time. So those are, I think, the critical building blocks for infusing at least one element of data into how you think about content. So I'll stop there and pass it on to Natalie to speak more about how this process can kind of come together and converge.
Yeah, no, I mean, Rick, I think what you talk about from an audience perspective, if you don't have kind of that full customer profile view, you're not going to be able to even think about topics or understand how to communicate to some of those individuals if you don't understand that. And honestly, throughout this next section, we're going to be touching on the actual creation of that content, but understanding the audience and how to talk to them, and understanding what are their likes, what are they talking about in some of their social circles, is really going to help with the ideation process, which is really kind of the first stage of when we're developing the content creation. So if we kind of switch to the next slide, again, a lot of those things that Rick pointed out are going to fuel the ideation stage, looking at specific hashtags that are being talked about on Twitter around topic areas, and then kind of pulling some insights from there. BuzzSumo is a great tool that we also use to monitor specific trends. You can also look at forums like Reddit and LinkedIn. LinkedIn has a great platform for different groups associated with different topic areas. So you can see what types of questions are people asking that they're searching for content about, or are there articles being shared consistently around certain topics. You can also look at, there's like specific Google tools that you can also leverage to understand what's being talked about in the media. Something that I do for a lot of the clients that we work with is set up just like trend alerts. And this is looking at if there's anything spoken about their industry or something that's released in the media, I get a notification about whatever that is in my inbox, and then we can figure out, do we want to be a part of this conversation? Do we want to comment on that conversation as well? So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at where to kind of source the ideas for a piece of content. But first, you need to understand where you're going to be serving this content to, because again, if you just kind of create a generalized piece of content and you don't know who you're talking to, you're going to be lumped in with kind of that content shock, and you're not going to be able to break through the noise. Something else that we also look at from a content ideation perspective is honestly just talking with our customers and leads. What are maybe some common questions that they are asking in the sales process or barriers? How can you develop content around some of those barriers that you can then leverage within the sales process? Because I guarantee you, if they're asking questions or maybe they have hesitations, they're probably not the only ones that do. And so just looking at all of these different data points of how you can be collecting these ideas from an ideation perspective, I think is great. And if you're thinking about this from, again, the ideation stage of who at the end of the day is going to be consuming this piece of content that I'm creating, and how can I make it the most consumable for them, you'll typically always win when you kind of put yourself in that mentality. So if we go to, again, next slide, where we're still talking through the ideation phase as well. Also looking at previous pieces of content that you guys have produced. How successful are they? Can you update them? So for instance, we typically do like a list like this every year of like looking at different types of marketing conferences to check out in 2017. Every time that we have written it, we see a ton of engagement in terms of social engagement and visitors to our site, but we actually get people inquiring and becoming leads. We do the same with some of the longer pieces of content on our website, which we kind of think of as like our pillar pieces. We typically look at updating those every year. So I think that it's really important to understand what's performed well in the past. How can we replicate that? How can we update that to accommodate maybe specific trends that are going on as well? And I think that's kind of a great playground for you to also look at when we're in the ideation phase of creating a single piece of content. As we slide into the next slide, we're going to kind of talk through the creation side of things. And again, a lot of this data too that we're pulling is from that State of the Digital Media report, where we looked at over 4 million pieces of content. We surveyed some of the top media editors in the world to kind of gain some of this insight here. But we're going to look at, we're going to examine performance. For instance, do headlines with numbers in them perform better? We're going to look at tools like CoSchedule, and they help analyze tools to help collect data on how that headline might perform. We're also going to look at like best practices for headlines. So according to our State of the Digital Media report, content with headlines that are typically between 8 to 11 words perform higher. Making sure that like the headline is long enough to tee up your content, but short enough for readers to easily digest. And then also looking at the headlines from a perspective of, do they directly address the target reader's problem? Are they clear? Are they compelling? And are they concise? So we'll kind of talk through those here in a minute. So if we go to the next slide again, and this is kind of looking at how are individuals engaging with the content that you're producing? Are they reading it? How are you identifying if the length of an article is applicable to the readership? And really understanding, again, how they're interacting with your content. And this is something that you will honestly need to test. You're not going to find this from one piece of content. So looking at like content heat maps is really great. You can again see how far are people reading into an article. Are they clicking in specific areas on the page where you're writing those pieces of content? We have used tools like Crazy Egg and Lucky Orange for heat maps. So those would definitely be two tools that you guys can definitely dive into. And then if we look at, if we're going to the next page now, looking at again the length. There's no perfect number in terms of what's the perfect number of words that's right for you. We see what performs well, but again, it's all thinking about who is my audience and what are some of those data points that I received that Rick talked about earlier, but also how can I make sure that this is easy to read and consumable? I mean, kind of put yourself in their seat. What type of content are you reading? And kind of taking that mentality when you are creating a piece of content. And so we do start to see, though, that there is a correlation between the length of the content that you have and how many social shares that you get on that specific article. So we're starting to see that content with 1,000 shares or more has an average word count of around 590 to 790 words. Content on publications with 1 million or more monthly visits, we start to see has an average word count of 480 to 695 words. Based on what we know in terms of the attributes of the best headlines, readers are more into content that doesn't take them too long to consume, but still explains concisely how or why to do something. These word count averages kind of speak to the value audiences place on their time and on the brand's abilities to be concise yet compelling. But I also think that we again need to look at the goals of the content that we're providing as well. So like for example, we have a few like pillar pieces of content that we produce at Influence & Co. And these pillar pieces of content are going to be the more comprehensive general topics. Like for instance, we have an article that talks about what is content marketing, which covers 1,000,001 different things. And so we're kind of using that as something that we link back to. It's much longer in nature, but again, you kind of have to look at the audience and the goals of the specific pieces of content that you're creating there. And again, if there's any questions in terms of word count or some of those averages, just shoot a question in that question box and we can be sure to answer it as well. But again, it's also looking at when we switch to the next slide, which talks about creation and the information that we're getting from the publications, you kind of have to look at it in multiple different ways. Again, put yourself in the driver's seat. How would you like to read a piece of article? What are you reading on a consistent basis? What are you not engaging with? When are you reading those specific pieces of content? Where are you reading those specific pieces of content? You, as a consumer of content yourself, can kind of be taking some of those different notes in your mind as well. So when we're looking at the day and the time of when we distribute content, we use tools like Buffer to help us understand when is the best time to push some of that content out. When we're looking at the medium, and that is just essentially selecting the right platform for the promotion of your content. That could take a variety of different forms. You could look at putting some paid ad spend behind the content that you're creating and testing that. And those could be, sponsored LinkedIn posts around specific content. It could be, Twitter sponsored posts. We could be doing Facebook ads behind the content that we're looking at. Also, when we're looking at the medium, are there specific media publications that we could be producing content on a consistent basis that reach our target audience as well? And then again, testing. I mean, I think that's something with content, you are always testing. On our end, we're evaluating at least every 3 months, if not sooner, to again understand how are people engaging with your content? What are some of the you know, streams of conversation that might be happening in terms of social around the content. How do we need to test that? Even looking at Facebook, you can run A/B tests on headlines to understand clickability, what images are working better, and then you can optimize those posts to what is getting the best engagement as well. And so I think that this is something that you should constantly be looking at in terms of these three areas of what is the best day and time, what is the best medium in terms of where can I get people to see my content beyond my own media assets, and how are people engaging with that? So those are three things that I think you should definitely constantly be looking at, and there's tools that can help you with each element of that. As we switch to the next slide as well, and I touched on this a little bit in the slide before, but this is really all about measurement. And measurement can kind of come in two different ways. We can look at it from a qualitative perspective, which is less tangible in terms of numbers, but I think it's a very important metric, if you will, to be looking at when it comes to content. So this might be, how have you been able to leverage a piece of content within your organization? How has it sped up a sales process? Or how has it helped you build credibility and trust with, you know, the potential client that you're working with? Or has it opened a door for a potential speaking opportunity? And then we start to look at the quantitative side of how these are actually performing. We use Google Analytics and HubSpot for our tools. There are many out there. Those are two that we're just familiar with, but looking at what to measure. So you can look at traffic. You can look at the read-through rate. How quickly is somebody reading through? What's the click-through rate? Then you can start to look at, again, some of those other types of metrics, such as social shares as well. But it's also, when you're evaluating this, I think it's important to understand, make sure you're evaluating it from not only a quantitative perspective, but a qualitative one as well. And then consistently evaluate and test what's working and see how people are engaging. So something that I've even done on our end, if we get somebody that inquires to us from like a contact form or an inbound lead, I've actually asked them straight out, how did you find us? Have you read any content previously about us? What were your thoughts there? What made you pick up the phone and want to talk through us? HubSpot is a great tool for that, and that's something where you can see if anybody has interacted with content before you even hop on the phone with somebody. So you can also kind of measure how educated in the process they are before you jump on the phone with them. So again, this is something that you're going to want to track on a weekly basis. You also want to look at it from, you know, even like a quarterly perspective to understand, are there any trends in the data that you're collecting and how this content is performing. So I can't harp on that enough. Constantly test, constantly evaluate, and then tweak your strategy based on those findings. Rick, if you want to dive into the next part, I think that would hit right up your alley.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thanks for that, Natalie. I love just the full display of the science that is there to really drive high impact content. I mean, we know that there's always going to be the art part of getting really engaged audiences, but there are such good ways, and I hope that's what the audience is getting from this, is that it is entirely within reach to know how to reach an audience and to be able to learn more about that audience, and then to put science and measurement around how that works. And the beauty of that is that if you look at the slide and the stats here, it underscores just how magnificent it can be when it's really done well. You can see increased engagement, you can see recommendations to friends or passing content through social networks. We know that this is really how these things go viral in a sense. And so my encouragement to the audience here is to just kind of take these things in stride and understand that there's such a rich and good world. And I always like to say we're really in the first quarter here. I mean, I think brands recognize that this is possible, but they haven't become so mature in what they're doing that they're consistently realizing the benefits of the statistics that you see here. And so I think the more that you can, even in some small ways, kind of carve out, how you can test and learn if you're not able to do everything that we're covering here for all that you actually, all of the content marketing that you're pushing out there, there's still always a really good opportunity to test and see if you can actually make these numbers become a reality in your world. So if you flip to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about just some of the things to avoid as you're on your journey. Obviously, garbage in, garbage out, so bad data, and that's certainly a truth in our world. If we ever get into a situation where our data quality is suspect, you can imagine how detrimental that is to our business. And so we're hyper vigilant around trying to make sure that our data is clean. And if you can constantly refresh and dedupe and do all the things that we're seeing here, it actually does drive a real sales impact. It helps marketing because you don't lose people from opt-outs and unsubs and whatnot. And this is really at the core. It'd be a shame to kind of go through all the hard work of getting all of these things aligned, that I was referencing and that Natalie has spoken to, and then to let, data or lack of quality data come into the mix and start to undercut some of the hard work that you've done. So my encouragement to the team is to the audience here today is to make sure that you have good process in place to constantly monitor and then work with, if you're using external parties, that you have a good way of working with them and identifying anytime you have any of these issues that arise. If you go to the next slide, and ultimately, I think where all of this is heading is what I would call like a virtuous loop of KYC, or know your customer, that helps you to find more and more insights or deliver insights, and then to leverage some of those insights in terms of segmenting audiences, and then using that as a means of kind of creating an overall better experience, because you're serving them with content that they actually care about, and that relevance is the thing that makes them want to come back time and again. And oh, by the way, you just get to know your customers all the more from how they engage. And so this is the virtuous cycle that I was alluding to. And at the end, this is really where kind of data meets all the personalized content that has been tuned in the many ways that Natalie outlined for you guys, and creates great experiences for whoever it is you're engaging, your customers, partners, and so on. So.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think, again, putting yourself in the driver's seat and thinking about how the person that you're trying to target, how they like to consume their information, which you can find out through a lot of the steps that Rick pointed out here. I might be somebody who's talked to differently than if you were to talk to Rick in terms of our communication styles. And so I think that's something where you do really need to understand a full picture of who you're targeting, so that you can then serve them up the right type of content that is going to, again, get the most engagement out of them and start to ultimately build trust with that consumer, and them, start to engage with you in some type of capacity, whether it's a partnership, whether it's a potential client, you name it. So again, there's a lot of information that we covered in here. I've got a couple of resources here that we're going to share now, and then also in a follow-up email. So we've got the State of the Digital Media Report that goes into much more depth of some of the analytics and data that we were finding that these publications are looking for, some of the trends that we're seeing, again, with content across the board today. We've got an interactive content strategy checklist. So these are just kind of some overarching elements that you need to be thinking about when you're putting together what you want to be talking through. And then again, the ultimate guide to content distribution, because you do need to be thinking about the distribution aspect as well when you're thinking about the content creation, so you can get eyes on that as well. So if you are wanting more tips on content marketing, or how to create an effective strategy, or you just have questions about some of the things that I specifically spoke about, within the webinar today. Feel free to set up a call, and then obviously if it's something where we see a fit between our two organizations and we can help you out, we'll give you $500 off your first month of services if you sign up before the 25th of April. So again, all of the resources are available in that link above, and we're going to be sending a follow-up email as well. But Rick, highly appreciate the collaboration here, and I'll let you talk about some of the FullContact resources.
Thanks for that, Natalie, and we'll wrap here shortly. Just want to highlight some of the resources that we are making available to the audience today. We have a number of pieces that you can see around data enrichment and how to use that to better get personal and understand your customers, both in a business and in a consumer context, how you can get those profiles enriched. And we have an offer here for free consultation. So we'll, if you use the link that we have here and you want to discuss further, we'll work with you to get a consultation to highlight exactly the possibilities that we can help in terms of driving your organization towards that data-driven capability that we've been talking about here this morning. So that's really all I have from a FullContact resource perspective. So I think now we're going to open the floor to questions and try and get any of your questions answered. So with that, I'll pass it back to Natalie and Kelsey so that we can get these questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick and Natalie, for coming and speaking today with this group. I think we were all able to take a little insight in how to utilize data a little bit more to create better content and rise above that noise. So I appreciate both your time, and we do have some questions here. So I'm going to go ahead and start. The first question for you guys is, and Rick, this might be more geared towards you because it's about the Enrich API, but can the Enrich API bring in post content from social media feeds?
The Enrich API is not actually going to bring in the posts themselves, but it will actually provide the identity key that can be linked to the post. So if you have a traditional social listening tool, I'll use that as an example, that brings in the content or the posts themselves, and you want to gain a better understanding of the actual people that is associated with that content, then bringing those two worlds together is made easy by leveraging Enrich API to understand the people behind the post. Hopefully that answers the question.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. And then here's another question for you guys. What are some other ways or techniques for gathering qualitative measurements or feedback with regards to the quality of the content?
Yeah, so I think you obviously need to understand what the engagement on your specific article is in comparison to other pieces of content that you're putting out there. I think that's like a tried and true teller, whether you can see if this piece of content is falling flat or if it's gaining some of that resonance as well. Something else that I have done, and this is more like when you're in the sales process. So say if you're in the sales process and you're talking with somebody who might have a specific barrier, maybe they don't understand maybe some of those like data API integrations, and you have an article that kind of talks them through that. When we get on the phone the next time, I will blatantly ask them, did you find that article valuable? Just to get some of that feedback. I think that there is no harm in asking for some of that as well. And then again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if you're getting an inbound request and you have a system on the back end, like a HubSpot, and you can see that they came from maybe a direct referral or an article, you can ask, that right there in and of itself, if they've read an article and they're reaching out to you, that's value in and of itself, right? And so I do ask for candor feedback. But again, it's something where we're always testing for some of the articles that might be falling flat. It might be something to do with the type of content that you're creating. So this might be something where those content heat maps might come into play, where you can see, did somebody even read the article, or where are they getting to? What's the stopping point? It might be something with the headline. So that could also be something where those A/B tests are going to come into play, and that's something that you constantly have to be looking at. So that's just something that we do on our end. But a lot of times I end up asking for like pretty transparent feedback if I'm using content to help build our credibility in the sales process, or even with a partner, of if they found that piece valuable, maybe specific elements that they found valuable, and then it also kind of gives a way to make sure that they actually read the resource that you're providing as well.
Perfect. Okay. Leading on to the next question, I believe, Natalie, this is for you. You mentioned you evaluate content every 3 months to see how it's performing. Are there different pieces of content that need a longer or shorter evaluation time?
I think it depends on, honestly, what your ultimate goals are, and depending on what type of content that you're creating as well. If you're creating kind of that evergreen content, obviously that has a long-term effect, and it just keeps compounding on it. So you can kind of look at that compounding effect of what is that engagement over time. But you can start to see, again, like when we're looking at it from almost an every 3 month or every quarter capacity of what this content is, we want to make sure that the content's relevant. So I wouldn't say that there's like a tried and true process for evaluating, a white paper versus, a blog article. I wouldn't say that there's like a recipe for that. Obviously, when you're looking at like a white paper or a piece of content that you have gated, you can start to see the success in terms of downloads that specific article has. You can start to see like some of the clickbacks. But you also want to look at that compounding effect as well, and you have to take into consideration how long that piece of content has been live. So obviously, if you're looking at an article that you just published versus, a blog article that you've had going for 6 months, there's obviously going to be discrepancies there on the engagement numbers. So you also have to take that into your evaluation period, and what your goals are. Obviously, if you're creating more of like a newsworthy based article and you're looking for some immediate traction, maybe there's been something that's been breaking in the news. Like for instance, we had some clients that wrote a few articles after Sony got hacked about kind of like the state of companies and their security features and like some of those different things. So obviously we want there to be high impact pretty quickly with a piece like that. But again, it kind of depends on your goals. Look at the compounding value. Do take into consideration how long pieces of content have been around for. And this is all something that should be kind of looked at when you're developing the strategy of what types of metrics you want to be looking at, what type of content pieces you guys do want to be creating, and what the goals of those are. And those will help the evaluation methods for you as you kind of work through that process.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. And then I did get a question here if there will be a replay. So there will be a replay of this deck. It will be sent out to everyone, including links to all those resources that we provided. So we will make sure everyone receives the recording as well as all of the resources that we shared here today. And then I do have a question that I'd like to hear from both Natalie and Rick on. It'd be great if they could get an example, a theoretical example of how you might use data to tweak or optimize a piece of content. And then if you want to take it a step further, how you would then use that data to distribute it as well. So I don't know who might want to start, but I'd love to hear kind of from both sides on this one.
Yeah, it's a great question. So thanks for the question. And I'm going to answer it from a data-centric and audience perspective, as I'm sure will come as no shock after you guys have had a chance to kind of understand our respective kind of places in our organization. So I always think about, a piece of content in terms of like who the people are and what commonality, or they're birds of a feather in an audience that can actually help you to understand what is resonating. So if you write an article and you have that published, and let's say generically it is a piece that is geared towards a high-tech community, but you would like to be able to understand, are there specific roles, for instance, that that content really seems to resonate with. So this is where some of our audience data, to the extent that you can understand the social handles, as a for instance, that are engaging in and around that content, we can help you to tease out what the roles are, which ones are over-indexing relative to what we would normally see in an audience. And then you can actually use that kind of feedback as a part of the loop that says, okay, when we write about topics like A, B, and C, we see that we tend to engage a more engineering audience versus a more business, sales, and marketing audience, both within a high-tech community. And so that level of kind of precision and understanding of who the people are and what they do, I think is just helpful in feeding into, the content ideation that Natalie described for you guys. And I think that's one way that we've seen folks use data like what you can get from FullContact.
Mm-hmm. I 150% agree with that as well. I mean, even with the data that you receive there, you can understand how to talk to somebody and what tone you need to carry with an article as well. So again, you can kind of make it a little bit more personalized. Even if it's, even if the data that you're providing and you're segmenting it out by location, that can also be something that you need to take into consideration with like the types of content that you're developing. When it comes to a distribution perspective, this is kind of where data is key, because you want to make sure that you're distributing the content to the right types of people. And as Rick said, if you're wanting to, speak to the engineer, you've got to look at distribution outlets, whether that's media publications, whether that is maybe LinkedIn groups, or whatever that is, that's where you're targeting. I think the audience data that you're collecting especially comes into play if you're looking at like putting some paid amplification behind the content. Like for instance, with LinkedIn, you can get extremely specific on who you want to be promoting your content to based on the role that an individual plays within a company, the size of the company, the location of a company. So all of those data points, again, can help you better target the content that you have already created as well.
Awesome. Thank you both. That was super helpful and great answer to that question. I did get one more request that there will be a recording into the questions box. Yes, we will be sending out a recording as well as all of the links to the resources that both Rick and Natalie have provided. We have a little bit more time left, but we don't have any additional questions as of right now. If there are any other questions, we will hang on for the next 5 minutes or so just to make sure there aren't any last minute things that pop into your head. But I will at this point just thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Rick, for taking the time to speak with everyone today. And thank you, audience, for joining us on this webinar. And if there are any follow-ups, we will be sending out an email. So feel free to reach out to either Influence & Co. Or FullContact if you have specific questions after this.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining and hanging out with us for an hour.
Yes. Thanks to the entire audience, and thanks for the collaboration, Natalie.